Hey guys, well today we're at the site of the Tippa Lodge in, Tippa County, Mississippi to introduce you to a guy named Paul James Rainey. Come along with us, let's go explore. Paul James Rainey was born on September the 18th, 1877, and he amassed a fortune that, most of us can't even understand from the coke and coal mining industries, which of course were important to industrial development in the United States in the late 1800s. Mr. Rainey was, an almost fabled character because you get the feeling if he had not been real, some writer somewhere would have created him. Since the lodge is real close to the birthplace of William Faulkner, I like to think that maybe he could have been one of his characters. Mr. Rainey's father actually developed most of the family fortune in coke. He was known as the Coke King, and Paul, who was known as Poor Paul back in these days, received the smallest part of his family's fortune. Poor Paul had an income of about $4,000 a day, at a time when most people made somewhere around $500 a year. This man could have lived and played anywhere he chose, and he picked a little place called Cotton Plant, Mississippi. He loved hunting, but he also raced cars and hydroplanes and horses, and for a time was considered the most skilled polo player in the country. Some even say he once proposed to actress and screenwriter Elsie Davis, but she rejected him. Mr. Rainey found North Mississippi after he met a Dr. Rogers of New Albany, who helped organize the first ever national field trials. These field trials were near West Point. This is sort of like the national championship for bird dogs. A really oversimplistic way of putting it is these dog owners compete to see whose dog is best at, flushing out quail. At any rate, Mr. Rainey found North Mississippi in 1901 and began buying property around 1904. He purchased what was then known as the Ratliff House and added on to it until it was nearly 400 feet long. The house had somewhere upward of 20 rooms, including the most famous trophy room, a heated swimming pool 20 feet deep at one end. It had electricity, steam heat, telephones just about everywhere, and indoor plumbing. Mr. Rainey generated power from his home from his own plant. Mr. Rainey's round barn held up to 50 polo ponies. He also kept large numbers of hunting dogs, like into the hundreds. They would be specially trained for different kinds of hunts. Here's a bear they kept chained out in front of Tippa Lodge to help train the dogs with. He was also probably the first to take dogs to Africa and hunt lion with. Employees of the Tippa Lodge lived in prefabricated Victorian cottages, and what became Mosley Chapel Church was built for them. Mr. Rainey certainly did not mind spending money. He owned about 10,000 acres and probably had control of somewhere around 30,000 acres. He would hold lavish hunting parties, we'll call them. He even built a rail spur line so his hunting party guests could have easy access to his Tippa Lodge. When he became concerned that the lodge could not hold all his guests, he built the Rainey Hotel in downtown New Albany. This is the Rainey as it exists today. W.C. Handy would regularly play for his cotton plant hunting parties. The Rainey Hotel here had marble floors and its own European chef. Mr. Rainey is said to have controlled somewhere around 6 area banks. He owned a cotton mill, a compress, and an old ice plant here. Mr. Rainey was a member of the National Geographic Society, and he filmed many of his hunts and expeditions. Some of these films would run for a year or more in movie theaters, and you can even find some of them online today. Some people even speculate that Mr. Rainey could have been a spy because he was paid around $1 million a year to take photos of wildlife. The Rainey hunting parties were exclusive events where guests would arrive at the Tipper Lodge in Pullman cars, but the picnic he gave on the 4th of July was open to everyone, no matter their race or creed or how much money they did or didn't have. Rainey traveled extensively to places like Russia, Africa, Europe, China, and the Arctic. During one Arctic expedition, which he and Harry Whitney were going to photograph and explore and hunt, they captured 2 polar bears and several other animals which they brought back and gave to the Bronx Zoo. During World War I, he tried to enlist, but was turned down due to health reasons. So he bought himself an ambulance and drove it in France during the war. He became a photographer for the Red Cross toward the end of the war. After the war, he purchased some land near Nairobi, British East Africa, because it was said to have held more game than any other area on the continent. He got together a hunting party and they set sail from Southampton to Cape Town. During the voyage, he suffered a suspicious death. He got in an argument one night with a fellow passenger who told him he would be dead by the end of the next day, and suddenly he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and was buried at sea. After his death, his sister, Grace Rainey Rogers, donated something like 26,000 acres of marshland in Perry, Louisiana, to the Audubon Society. The Paul J. Rainey Wildlife Sanctuary was an outstanding start for the Audubon system. The Audubon Society calls Rainey a high-living young man whose escapades made him notable even in the roaring 20s. Paul J. Rainey was even a YouTube creator. You can find his film of the last known home of Tsar Nicholas of Russia in the Library of Congress collection of early motion pictures on YouTube. Let's take one last look at Tipper Lodge today. This house that is here today is not Tipper Lodge, but there are a couple buildings that still remain. The large square-looking building is the trophy room, and you can see the topmost part of the circle barn up behind the hill. The animals you've been seeing in the video today are in a local museum now, but they were once in his trophy room. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Paul J. Rainey today. He was a playboy, a partier, a very wealthy man, and for a time, a Mississippian. Thank you.